Hello, and welcome to The Bard's Truth, with your host, the Green Bard. This is
Dany's Dragon Bonds, Volume 3, Part 1.
Dany, Drogon, and her children alight upon Slaver's Bay, covering Dany and her bond to her dragons in a storm of swords. In A Clash of Kings, Dany's dragons went from hatchlings to fledglings, and finally started to fly and breathe fire at the end. In A Storm of Swords, they show their power, moving toward being adult dragons. A Storm of Swords also represents a transitional period in Dany's bond with her dragons. Our dragon themes, a list with similarities and differences to our Direwolf bond themes, are in evidence in several interactions between Dany and her dragons. I think George R. R. Martin has made these human/beast bonds very similar in many aspects. First, consider the Warg or Direwolf bond themes: mirroring mood, personality, and intelligence. Obedience versus independence. Shadowing/protecting/savagery, coupled with a healthy fear of the wolves and their innate ability to sense threats. Belonging to the pack/the instinct to hunt. Being affectionate when together, and related is physical contact enhancing the bond. And finally, bad things happening when they're separated. For the most part, the list translates to dragons rather well, but there are some notable differences. The dragon bond or dragon rider themes are mirroring personality, moods, and intelligence. That's the same. Independence versus obedience. In this case, the independence of the dragons takes precedent. They're deferential only when it suits them, and as they age, they're growing out of any prior obedience. Savagery/protection. The fear of the dragons and the direwolves is a common theme, as is their ability to sense threats. Power. Strength/superiority/domination over prey. This is different from the direwolves' pack/hunt theme. They have a complete lack of fear of humans and their prey, because humans actually are prey in some cases, and they have an insatiable appetite. Touch/affection. Physical contact enhancing the bond. This is similar. And then separation. That's also similar to our direwolf bond theme. Bad things happen when they're separated. Mirroring happens mostly between Dany and Drogon, as we will see in this volume. This makes sense as they will eventually become a bonded dragon/rider pair. The other two remain her children. I will note that even though we have mainly eliminated the pack theme in dragon lore, we will see some evidence that the dragons do share some type of telepathic connection in this volume, though I would categorize that as similar to mirroring. A Storm of Swords, Daenerys 1. The highlight of this chapter, to me, is the excitement seeing all three dragons fly for the first time in the story. An undercurrent, though, is the savagery and aggressiveness, foreshadowing their use in war. Dany is joyful in these first scenes. She loves sailing and she loves her dragons.
Yet even so, as she stood upon the forecastle watching her dragons chase each other across a cloudless blue sky, Daenerys Targaryen was as happy as she could ever remember being.
Later.
The narrow sea was often stormy, and Dany had crossed it 100 times as a girl, running from one free city to the next, half a step ahead of the usurper's hired knives. She loved the sea.
Later.
Once, on a voyage to Braavos, as she'd watched the crew wrestle down a great green sail in a rising gale, she had even thought how fine it would be to be a sailor. But when she told her brother, Viserys had twisted her hair until she cried. "You are blood of the dragon," he had screamed at her. "A dragon, not some smelly fish."
That last bit is not a fond memory. It could foreshadow her shedding of Viserys and the negativity he brought into her life. However, that idea is opposed by her taking up the quest that he failed to achieve, reconquering the Seven Kingdoms. I think it clear that she has both Targaryen and Valyrian blood running through her veins. Why should she not be a dragon and a fish? Will she break free of his abuse, become her own woman, or will she be beholden for all her life to what Viserys wants her to be, only a dragon? Next, we are reminded of the theme from A Clash of Kings, that the dragons have free will of their own and are not property, and should not be caged if you want them to be happy. The same is true of Dany, come to think of it. This should be remembered in A Dance with Dragons, with the caging of her dragons, and the bottling up of her own ambitions.
At first Groleo had wanted the dragons caged, and Dany had consented to put his fears at ease, but their misery was so palpable that she soon changed her mind and insisted they'd be freed. Even Captain Groleo was glad of that now. There had been one small fire, easily extinguished. Against that, Balerion suddenly seemed to have far fewer rats than she'd had before, and her crew, once as fearful as they were curious, had begun to take a queer, fierce pride in their dragons. Every man of them, from captain to cook's boy, loved to watch the three fly, though none so much as Dany. They are my children, she told herself, and if the Magi spoke truly, they are the only children I am ever like to have.
Next we get further descriptions of Dany's dragons as they fly ever higher.
Viserion scales were the color of fresh cream, his horns, wing bones, and spinal crest a dark gold that flashed bright as metal in the sun. Rhaegal was made of the green of summer and the bronze of fall. They soared above the ships in wide circles, higher and higher, each trying to climb above the other.
Their majesty in that scene is literally the calm before the storm, a prelude to violence. Surprise attack seems to be their modus operandi, because, as we see, they like to gain altitude to attack from above. This foreshadows Dany's attack on Astapor later, and I dare say she did it from the high ground, if you take my meaning.
Dragons always preferred to attack from above, Dany had learned. Should either get between the other and the sun, he would fold his wings and dive screaming, and they would tumble from the sky locked together in a tangled, scaly ball, jaws snapping and tails lashing. The first time they had done it, she feared that they meant to kill each other, but it was only sport. No sooner would they splash into the sea than they would break apart and rise again, shrieking and hissing, the salt water steaming off them as their wings clawed at the air.
While Rhaegal and Viserion play like the children they are to Dany, though it is a fierce and potentially deadly game, Drogon is off hunting. His separation from the other two is thematic. I believe it represents how Dany's bond to Drogon is different. As I discussed in our first volume, his is the first egg that she bonds with. I think it is already destined in our author's mind that she will ride him. Thus, he is not portrayed doing childlike things, and his savagery and ferocity are brought to mind with the act of hunting.
Drogon was aloft as well, though not in sight. He would be miles ahead or miles behind, hunting. He was always hungry, her Drogon. Hungry and growing fast. Another year, or perhaps 2, and he may be large enough to ride.
And he is even foreshadowed in the passage to be written. Dany knows too, not just George R. R. Martin. However, even with their majesty and ferocity, at this size they can't yet be ridden, and they are very vulnerable.
But that time was not yet come. Rhaegal and Viserion were the size of small dogs, Drogon only a little larger, and any dog would have outweighed them. They were all wings and neck and tail, lighter than they looked.
We see next that Dany shares feelings with Drogon on the snail's pace of their sailing. Is Dany mirroring Drogon's feelings through the bond, or vice versa?
"I cannot see Drogon," said Ser Jorah Mormont as he joined her in the forecastle. "Is he lost again?" "We are the ones who are lost, Ser. Drogon has no taste for this wet creeping, no more than I do. Bolder than the other two, her black dragon had been the first to try his wings above the water, the first to flutter from ship to ship, the first to lose himself in a passing cloud, and the first to kill. The flying fish no sooner broke the surface of the water than they were enveloped in a lance of flame, snatched up and swallowed." "How big will he grow?" Dany asked curiously. "Do you know?"
Dany gives a lot of weight to the idea that Drogon has a will of his own in matters, and quite a strong will at that, dare I say, even in an opinion. That passage also hints in another way as to how Drogon may be more special than the other two dragons, from the mention of his size. This is, of course, an oblique comparison to Ghost, Jon Snow's direwolf. Beyond that passage, the red eyes, mentioned in prior volumes, may also be a clue to Drogon's being special, as they were for Ghost. Continuing that theme in the next passage, the size of dragons remains a focus, strengthening the comparison of Drogon and Ghost, largest of their pods. Speaking of Dany knowing Drogon's thoughts, we see more evidence of the intellect of dragons when Jorah discusses the stories of wise old dragons. This is worth taking note because George R. R. Martin is influenced by Tolkien, and we know that Smaug was sentient and able to clearly communicate with Bilbo in The Hobbit. I wonder how sentient Drogon is now and moving forward. You'll recall that I feel he was communicating with Dany even as an egg. They are intelligent, no doubt, no doubt.
In the Seven Kingdoms, there are tales of dragons who grew so huge that they could pluck giant krakens from the seas.
Later.
It is only a tale, Khaleesi, said her exile knight. They talk of wise old dragons living 1,000 years as well.
While Jorah makes light of the idea of wise old dragons, I think our author is hinting that it may have been true. The next passage certainly doesn't discount the idea that they could live that long anyway. The exposition on dragons returns to their vulnerability, and weaves in a mention of freedom. George R. R. Martin is making a thematic statement about people and beasts under oppressive conditions versus having freedom to thrive. It continues to foreshadow Dany smashing the slave trade. It should also be a clue that she would not ever plan to sell Drogon into bondage to slavers.
Well, how long does a dragon live? She looked up as Viserion swooped low over the ship, his wings beating slowly and stirring the limp sails.
Ser Jorah shrugged. A dragon's natural span of days is many times as long as a man's, or so the songs would have us believe. But the dragons the Seven Kingdoms knew best were those of House Targaryen. They were bred for war, and in war they died. It is no easy thing to slay a dragon, but it can be done.
Later.
Balerion the Black Dread was 200 years old when he died during the reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator.
He was so large he could swallow an aurochs whole.
A dragon never stops growing, Your Grace, so long as he has food and freedom.
Freedom? Asked Dany, curious. What do you mean?
In King's Landing, your ancestors raised an immense domed castle for their dragons. The Dragon Pit, it is called. Yet, even so, it was noted that none of the pit dragons ever reached the size of their ancestors. The maesters say it was because of the walls around them and the great dome above their heads.
I mean, from a meta perspective, we wouldn't know because the maesters caused the Dance of the Dragons, which killed all the dragons, but sure, why not? Sir Barristan then argues with Ser Jorah, but also highlights the death of the dragons. All in war, save for Balerion.
Men are men, Whitebeard replied. Dragons are dragons. Ser Jorah snorted his disdain. What do you know of dragons anyway? I served for a time in King's Landing in the days when King Aerys sat the Iron Throne and walked beneath the dragon skulls that looked down from the walls of his throne room.
Dany's thoughts circle back to the value of dragons, completing the foreshadowing mentioned earlier. She ponders especially the theme of their protection, but with an undercurrent of power and ferocity.
The Carthian merchant had coveted her dragons.
Later.
Thankfully, I have Ser Jorah and my blood riders. And my dragons, never forget. In time, the dragons would be her most formidable guardians, just as they had been for Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters 300 years ago. Just now, though, they brought her more danger than protection. In all the world there were but 3 living dragons, and those were hers. They were a wonder and a terror, and beyond price.
We then learn that all 3 dragons can now breathe flame. The scene is consistent with my theory that Drogon is already bonded to Dany in a mutually exclusive dragon rider bond, and the others are her children. The interaction with Rhaegal is affectionate, but in a parent-child manner.
Dany sat cross-legged on her bunk in the captain's cabin, feeding her dragons.
Later.
She took a chunk of salt pork out of the bowl in her lap and held it up for her dragons to see. All 3 of them eyed it hungrily. Rhaegal spread green wings and stirred the air, and Viserion's neck swayed back and forth like a long, pale snake's as he followed the movement of her hand. Drogon, Dany said softly. Dracarys, and she tossed the pork in the air. Drogon moved quicker than a striking cobra. Flame roared from his mouth, orange and scarlet and black, searing the meat before it began to fall. As his sharp black teeth snapped shut around it, Rhaegal's head darted close, as if to steal the prize from his brother's jaws. But Drogon swallowed and screamed, and the smaller green dragon could only hiss in frustration. "Stop that, Rhaegal," Dany said in annoyance, giving his head a swap. "You had the last one. I'll have no greedy dragons." She smiled at Ser Jorah. "I won't need to char their meat over a brazier any longer."
"So I see. Dracarys?"
All three dragons turned their heads at the sound of that word, and Viserion let loose with a blast of pale gold flame that made Ser Jorah take a hasty step backward. Dany giggled. "Be careful with that word, Ser, or they're like to singe your beard off. It means dragon fire in High Valyrian."
Drogon's feeding scene is truly savage. Note the language as well. Dragons scream. That is their call. It is meant to be terrible and fearsome. The next passage seems to indicate Dany and Drogon's minds are telepathically linked. Drogon hisses with disapproval, which is how Dany felt at Jorah's suggestion, even as she laughs. This is clear mirroring.
"Khaleesi, has it occurred to you that Whitebeard and Belwas might have been in league with the assassin? It might all have been a ploy to win your trust." Her sudden laughter made Drogon hiss, and sent Viserion flapping to his perch above the porthole. "The ploy worked well."
In the subsequent discussion about whether the dragons will bring wealth in Astapor as in Karth, Dany is upset when she thinks of the Magi who killed Khal Drogo. Again, Drogon mirrors her. Note that the skin she references is that of Illyrio Mopatis, who has also wronged her in selling her to said Khal Drogo.
His skin. Across the cabin, Drogon stirred restlessly, steam rising from his snout. "Mirima's doer betrayed me. I burned her for it."
It's another indication of the mind-mingling bond between Dany and Drogon, like the Starks and their direwolves. Note how Drogon is listening to all of Jorah's counsel, as in A Clash of Kings. This is key to Dany's last chapter of A Dance with Dragons, in my opinion, when Drogon potentially speaks in Jorah's voice. And that's it for this episode. We'll see you next time when they arrive in Astapor.
Thanks to all the terrific artists featured on these videos.
Thanks especially to those in my family who helped in this series so far. If you enjoy this content, you can also consider supporting us on Patreon.